Hey, welcome back to InfoGamer. My name's Nathan, and this is going to be the first lesson of a brand new tutorial series that I want to begin. This series is going to be all about how to create a first-person controller using the new and upcoming input system in Unity. Now, I know that there's already several tutorials out there on how to create first-person controllers in Unity, but what's going to be different about this series is one, it's going to be built around using this new input system in Unity, and two, I want to evolve this first-person controller over a period of time. So we'll probably start out with a very basic first-person controller, like what they had in the very first Halo. Then we'll try to add more advanced features to our first-person controller, like what can be found in more recent games, such as sliding, vaulting, maybe even wall running or jetpacks. Now for this first lesson, I'm going to show you how to set up your project. I'm then going to show you the basic game objects that you'll need for your first-person controller. And then I'm going to show you how to code the WASD movement using the new input system. Now before we begin, make sure that you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you can get updates when we publish new videos. So here I have a brand new project open inside of Unity, and I've already gone ahead to create what I'll be showing you in this lesson. So the first thing that I'd like to do is demonstrate what it is and how it works. So I'm going to click play. So the camera that's capturing our game view is our first person camera. This is a camera that is attached to our first person controller. And then in the scene view, you'll be able to see what's actually happening. So we have this cube object that I stretched out to be a platform for our player to walk on. And then we have this capsule object, which is our first-person controller. So now if I use WASD on my keyboard, you'll be able to see how I can walk around in the scene. Now at the moment, this is the only control that we have for our first-person controller. We have forward movement, backward movement, and we had sideways strafing. And we don't have any rotation of the player, but just to show you that this movement is based in the local space of our player, I want to rotate our capsule object. And now when I press W, you can see that we're still moving forward in the local space of our character. You want to have the basic movement be in the local space of your player object because when you press W, you want to be walking forward in the direction that your object is facing. If it was based in world space, then it wouldn't matter what direction your player was facing, your player would just move in north, south, east, west directions. So now that you can see what we'll be working on in this lesson, let's get on to setting up our project. So first off, you want to start by creating a new project and you want to select 3D when you create that project. Then since we're going to be using the new input system in Unity, we need to install that package. So we're going to go to Window and then Package Manager. Now if you're watching this video and Unity has fully released their input system, then it should appear in the column to the left. But if they haven't released it yet, then you need to click on this Advanced drop-down menu and select Show Preview Packages. We're then going to scroll down in the left-hand column to where we see Input System, and I'm currently using 0.2.0 Preview. When you select this package, there should be a button that says Install or Import, and you're going to want to click that button. But since I've already installed this, I don't have that button. Once it's finished installing, we're then going to go to our Edit drop-down menu and select Project Settings. Here in this window, on the left-hand side, you should see an option that says Input, which is the old input system, and then there should also be Input New, which is the new input system. We want to make sure that we select the new input system, and when you first select this option, everything's going to be grayed out because you need to create a new input settings file. To do this, there's this button here that says New, and we're going to click that. You can then find a location which you want to save this input settings file, and I've named mine FPS Controller. You'll then want to click Save, but since I've already created one, I'm just going to close this window. Now for the time being, we're going to leave all of these options as default, but one thing to note is this last option called Supported Devices. Here you can use this plus sign to specify a certain type of input device. But if you leave this option blank, then you're going to maintain the support for all input devices. And so that's what we're going to do. So now that we've imported the new input system, let's take a break from this and go over to our scene to set up our first-person controller game object. So first things first, we need to create our environment, and the only object that we need at this point in time is a ground for our player to walk on. And to create this, you can just start with a cube object. You'll then need to scale this object up in the X and Z directions as I've done with my other cube here. I have both the X and the Z at 100. Then if you want to, you can apply a new material to this object so it's not just a plain white. I'd recommend doing this so that your first-person controller doesn't blend into the ground. So now that we have the environment set up, let's create the first-person controller. Now I've already created one here, but I'm going to walk through the steps on how to recreate this. So we're going to start with an empty game object. So I'm going to go to the Create drop-down menu and select Create Empty. I'm then going to rename this to FPS Controller. Then we want to add what's called a character controller, and to do this we're going to use the Add Component drop-down menu, and you can search CHA and it should be the first option. I'm going to disable my other first-person controller so we're not distracted by that game object. And so this is what we have so far. It's an empty game object with the character controller component, and the character controller component comes with what looks like a capsule collider. Now what we want to do is move this capsule collider up so that the transform of this object is right at the base of the capsule collider. So I'm going to use this vector 3 that's called center, and I'm going to move it up in the Y direction by 1. Now what we need to do is create a visual placeholder object so that we can see our first-person controller in the scene. And to do this, I'm going to right-click on our first-person controller, go down to 3D object, and I'm going to select capsule. Now as you can see, our capsule object doesn't line up with our first-person controller, and so to fix this, I'm going to select our capsule object. I'm going to move it up in the Y direction by 1. Now the next thing I'm going to do for now is remove the capsule collider component of our capsule object. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because our character controller component comes with its own capsule collider, and so I'm not going to worry about having two capsule colliders in the same object. Next up, we want to create our first-person camera, and so I'm going to right-click on our first-person controller and then go down to camera. Now this will place our camera down at the bottom of our capsule object, but we want to have our camera more at what would be eye level, and so I'm going to move its Y position to 1.5. Now one thing you have to check is to make sure that the projection of your camera is pointing in the Z direction of your first-person controller. Now the Z axis is represented by the blue arrow of your Move tool, and so I'm going to select my capsule object, and I'm going to select my first-person controller, and if the blue arrow is pointing in the same direction, then you know that they all have the same orientation. Another way to check this is to make sure that all of the rotations are zeroed out. Now these are all the objects that we'll need at this point in time for our first-person controller. So I'm just going to delete my first-person controller and then re-enable my other one. So now let's set up our input settings and we'll code our WASD movement. To do this, we can go to our project window and right-click. We're then going to go to create, and then down at the very bottom we have input actions. And so you're going to select this, but I already have one created right here. Now I named mine input controls, and once you have it created, we're then going to double click on it. And that'll bring up this window here, and you can dock it if you wish. Now for the most part, this window is going to look pretty empty. And so we're going to start by creating what's called an action map, and we can create that by clicking this plus sign here. You're then going to want to give this file a name, and I've already created one called FPS. Once you create a new action map, your actions column should be empty, but if there's something there, that's all right. Now if it is empty, you're going to click this plus sign at the top right to add a new action. You can then give this action a name. I've named mine Move, but I'm going to name this one Move 2. And I'm just showing you how I created this first action, so don't create a second one. Now with this action, you'll also have an empty binding. Now what we're going to do is remove this binding, and then we're going to click on the plus sign next to our new action, and we're going to select Create 2D Vector Composite. Then if you want, you can rename where it says Vector 2 to something like WASD, and this will give you 4 input options for up, down, left, and right. Now what we want to do is assign our WASD keys to these different options. So I'm going to select up, and then over here in the properties window, I'm going to select path. We can then type in W to the search bar and select W keyboard. I'm then going to select down and then go to path, and I'm going to type in S and then select S keyboard. I'm then going to select left and then click on the path drop down menu, type in an A and select A keyboard. And then I'm going to select right, go to path, type in a D and then select D keyboard. Once you have all of these key bindings set up, we're then going to click on our WSD option, and over here in our properties where it says interactions, we're going to click this plus sign and select press. I'm then going to do this a second time so that we should have 2 pressed options. I'm then going to click on the second pressed option, and I'm going to use this drop-down menu that's next to trigger behavior to select release only. This will make it so that this action event is broadcast anytime we press down on one of these 4 keys or whenever we release one of these 4 keys. Now, since I have 2 movement actions, I'm going to remove my second one. Now, the next thing that we need to do is go over to our inspector, and we should be able to see some additional options for our input controls. And what we want to do is select where it says Generate C# class. Once you have this selected, we can then go over to where it says Save Asset, and we're going to click that button. This should create a new script in your project window called Input Controls. Now, if we want to, we can open the script up in Visual Studios. And here you can have a look at what this script does, but you don't have to understand what the script does in order to use it. So I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to go back to Unity. Next up, we need to create our first-person controller script. So I'm going to go to my scripts folder, and here you can see I've created my FPS controller script. Now I'm going to open this up in Visual Studios. Now inside this script, you're first going to need to include this namespace up at the top. This is using unityengine.experimental.input. Next up, we need to create some variables. The first variable that I have is a private variable, which I've included serialized field out in front. And this way we can see it in our inspector, even though this variable is private. And this variable is of type input controls, which is that new class that Unity created for us. And I've called this input controls with a lowercase I. Next up, we need to create a private variable for our character controller component. So this is private character controller, and I've named this myCC. Next up, we need to create a private vector2, and this is called moveAxis. Next up, we have a private float called walkSpeed, and I've set this to be a serialized field. And then finally, we have a private float called strafingSpeed, and I've also made this a serialized field. These 2 variables will make it so that we can have 2 different speeds for going forwards and backwards versus side to side. Now, once we have these variables created, the next thing that we need to do is register to our input action events. And we'll do this within the onEnable function. So the first thing that we want to do is access our input controls variable. Then we're going to use .fps, which is accessing our action maps, this thing right here. We then want to access .move, which is our action right here. Then we want to call .perform. We then want to use the += operator to register an action callback, which I've called movement input. Now, when you first type this line of code, you'll probably be receiving an error underneath movement input. To fix this, you can click on movement input and then hold Alt and press Enter, and then select the first option to generate, and that'll create this function here, which I have down at the bottom. This function is a private void function, which I've called movement input. And for the parameter, we're passing in an input action and then .callback context, and I've called this context. Inside this function, all we have to do is set our move axis equal to context.readValue, and then we're looking for a vector2. Now, an action event is kind of like a message that is broadcast out to all the other scripts in our project. But in order for a script to receive that message, it has to be listening for that action event. And that's what we're doing in our onEnable function. So this is the action event. And by using the += operator, we are saying that we want this script to listen for this event. And when we receive that message, we then want to call this function. Now there's one more thing that we need to do in order for this action to work properly, and that is this next line of code where we are calling inputController.fps.move.enable. Now the really cool thing about this new input system is the fact that it uses these action events. Now in the past, most of the time you had to rely on the update function in order to receive player input. For example, we would have an if statement in our update function that would be something like if input.getMouseButtonDown parentheses 0, then inside the if statement we would call like a fire function or something like that. And this basically meant that in every frame of our game, we would try to run through this if statement. But by using action events and this new input system, those if statements and conditions are handled for us, and they won't be called every frame. Now there'll still be a need for update functions, and we'll talk about that in a second, but the next thing that we need to do is unregister this function from the action event, and we'll do this in the onDisable function. So here I have my onDisabled function, and to create this you can actually just copy the onEnable function and paste it down here and then change it to onDisable. You're then going to want to change this from plus equals to minus equals. And then rather than calling the enable function, we want to call the disable function. And this basically cleans up this script and makes sure that we don't have any memory leaks. So once we've handled our onEnable function and our onDisable function, the next thing that we need to do is initialize our myCC variable. And so in the start function, I'm calling myCC equals getComponent, and then I'm looking for a character controller. We then have our update function, and inside this update function I have this if statement where I'm checking to see if our moveAccess variable does not equal 0. I then have the OR operator to also check to see if myCC.isGrounded equals false. I have this exclamation mark out in front. And so if either one of these conditions is true, then we're going to execute the player movement function, which I've created right here. This is a void function, and the first line of code that we're doing is we're creating a local variable, which is a vector3 called movement, and I'm setting it equal to vector3.0. On the next line of code, we want to set up the forward and backward movement of our player, and so I'm calling our local movement variable. I then have the plus equals operator, and I'm adding the transform.forward value of our player object. I'm then multiplying it by our moveAccess.y, which is the variable that's being set in our movement input function. And so whenever we press W or whenever we press S, the Y value of our moveAccess vector2 is going to be set to a 1 or a -1. We then want to multiply this by our walk speed variable, and then we want to multiply this by time.deltaTime. Next up, we want to set up the sideway movement of our player object. And so I'm calling movement and then the plus equals operator, and I'm setting it equal to transform.right times moveAccess.x times strafing speed times time.deltaTime. So these two lines of code are very similar, but we're swapping out the y for an x, and we're swapping out walk speed for strafing speed. Now for this line of code, if we press D or if we press A, the x value of our moveAccess is either going to be a +1 or a -1. Or it's going to be somewhere in between if we're using a joystick. Now on the next line of code, we want to add gravity to our player movement, and so I'm calling movement plus equals physics.gravity. If you want to speed up how fast your character falls, then you could multiply this by some value. Now on the last line of code for this function, we want to apply this movement variable to our character controller. And so I'm calling myCC.move, and then I'm passing in the movement variable as parameter. So to recap everything that's happening, we have our input controller script, which is looking for player input of pressing W, A, S, or D. We then have our FPS controller script, which is registering to the action events of those keys. If a player presses one of those keys, then we're calling our movement input function. Then inside this function, we are setting our moveAccess variable to the vector2 given to us by the action event. We then have our update function, which is checking to see if this moveAccess variable is equal to some other value than 0, or if our character controller is not touching the ground. If one of these conditions is true, then we're calling our player movement function. And then inside this function, we are setting the speed that we want to apply to our player. And so on this line of code, we are setting the forward and backward movement of our player. In this line of code, we're setting the sideway movement of our player. And on this line of code, we are applying gravity to our player. And then finally, this line of code, we are applying that movement to our player. Now with all of this code in our script, we can save our script and then go back to Unity. Inside Unity, the last thing that we need to do is select our FPS controller game object and then drag on our FPS controller script into the inspector. And then we need to set our variables. And so for input controls, I'm going to go to our project window and I'm going to select our input actions file, which is called input controls, and I'm going to drag it in there. And then we can set the value for our walk speed and our strafing speed. My strafing speed was a little slow, so I think I'm going to bump that up. Now that's the last thing that we need to do to create the basic movement for our first-person controller. And so I'm going to play my project one more time to test it out. So here in my scene view, I have my first-person controller game object, which is this capsule. And then in my game view, I have my first-person camera. And if I click W, you can see that I'm walking forward. If I click A, I'm now moving to the left. If I click S, I'm now moving backwards. And if I click D, I'm now moving to the right. Then if I want, I can rotate my first-person controller. And that way, when I press W, you can see that I'm still moving forward with regards to my local space. If I press S, I'm still walking backwards. If I press A, I'm still moving to the left. And if I push D, I'm still moving to the right. So that's everything that I'm going to cover in this lesson on how to create the basic movements of a first-person controller using the new input system in Unity. If you found this video to be helpful, make sure that you give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below or join our Discord server. And finally, make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.